I stared into the gilded mirror of the bridal suite, applying my lipstick. The rehearsal dinner buzzed outside, another lavish production starring my sister Amber. Her endless demands had been a heavy weight all week, a manipulation designed to keep me serving her perfectly curated narrative. Suddenly, the heavy oak door clicked shut. My husband Mark grabbed my arm. His face was entirely pale, his eyes locked onto mine with terrifying urgency. "We have to leave," he whispered, "now." Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. We did not run. Panic implies a lack of control. We walked out the back exit of the venue with purpose, our steps measured and silent. By the time we were sealed inside the soundproof cabin of our car, Mark's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He didn't waste time softening the blow. He operated with the precision I loved him for. He told me he had stepped into the narrow alcove behind the catering kitchen to take a call, only to overhear my mother, Linda, and Amber conspiring. They weren't discussing floral arrangements or seating charts. They were actively discussing the $12 million estate my late father had left behind. They were discussing how to medically incapacitate me during the dinner. The goal was to ensure a severe medical emergency would render me completely unable to contest the trust before the deadline expired at midnight. I didn't scream. I didn't cry or ask how a mother could do this to her own daughter. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I simply reached into the back seat, opened my laptop, and powered it up. People on the outside might ask why I had endured their escalating, unreasonable demands for so long, assuming my passivity was a symptom of profound weakness. But staying and complying was not a flaw. It was the invisible chain of the survivor. When you are raised in a constantly abusive environment, you develop a form of learned helplessness, a psychological adaptation where mere survival looks exactly like compliance. I hadn't been weak. I had been managing an ongoing crisis, trapped in a psychological prison that did not have iron bars, but rather the suffocating, heavy expectations of familial duty. Subsidizing Amber's massive wedding had been an operational cost I accepted to keep the peace and manage the merger. But the contract was now officially void. They had moved from emotional taxation to physical threat. I opened my banking portal. For months, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for the extravagant catering company, currently setting up the reception inside. It took exactly 3 clicks to cancel the vendor contract and withdraw my payment authorization entirely. Next, I navigated to the secondary family account one, where I was the sole legal owner, but had granted them authorized user status for my mother's daily living expenses. I had granted them access to a sub-account for their living expenses, but as the primary account holder, I held the master administrative keys to revoke their permissions instantly. I initiated a total administrative freeze. The funds were instantly locked. "This isn't revenge," I told Mark, watching the confirmation screen illuminate the dark interior of the car. "It is accounting." I closed the laptop with a decisive snap. The entire operation took exactly 4 minutes. They were sitting inside, expecting a compliant victim to eat their poisoned meal and surrender an empire. Instead, they were about to face a highly motivated creditor who had just severed their primary supply line. The retaliation had begun. As Mark drove us away from the sprawling estate venue, I systematically reviewed the ledger of sacrifices that had defined my entire existence. Growing up, our household was a textbook case of scapegoating and the golden child versus black sheep dynamic. Amber was the golden child, the perfect investment, constantly praised, protected, and artificially elevated, while I was assigned the role of the black sheep, bearing the burden of every family failure. This toxic dichotomy isn't just about simple favoritism, it is a structural mechanism designed to maintain ultimate control by keeping one child elevated and the other perpetually trying to earn their basic human worth. Linda treated Amber like an absolute goddess. She constantly excused her terrible grades, her endless entitlement, and her reckless spending habits. Meanwhile, my achievements were aggressively ignored and written off as standard expectations. When I struggled briefly in my early 20s and took a required gap year to manage burnout, Linda immediately branded me a dropout. She cemented that narrative in the family archives. permanently labeling me as the defective investment who would never amount to anything. But I had not dropped out. I had merely relocated my efforts to a more profitable sector. Over the last decade, I had quietly and methodically built a massive professional portfolio. I went back to school, graduated at the very top of my class, and became a highly successful commercial architect. I managed massive urban development projects and accumulated significant independent wealth. Mark, a structural engineer I met on a complex high-rise project, was the only one who truly knew the full extent of my success. To Linda and Amber, I was still the invisible, struggling sister they could coerce into doing their dirty work. They believed I was paying for wedding vendors out of a desperate attempt to buy their love. They believed I was a failing asset, clinging to them for relevance. Now I realized their affection had always been a premium subscription, with me quietly footing the bill. They assumed I was an easy target for their estate grab because they thought I lacked the financial resources and the intellect to fight back. They calculated that a simple poisoning would remove the inconvenient black sheep and secure my half of the $12 million estate. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights, my mind processing the data. My mother and sister had weaponized my inherent desire for a family, using it as a deliberate smokescreen to execute a hostile takeover of my father's assets. But their data was hopelessly outdated. They were plotting against a college dropout who no longer existed. They didn't realize they had just declared war on a master architect who knew exactly how to identify structural weaknesses and dismantle a failing foundation. The operational fallout hit the very next morning with spectacular efficiency. The high-end catering company, having received my immediate cancellation and payment reversal, packed up their extensive equipment and abandoned the venue just 12 hours before the wedding ceremony. When Linda confidently attempted to access the joint family account to fix the escalating financial crisis, she found the funds completely frozen. The massive capital they relied on to maintain their illusion of wealth was gone. Instead of reflecting on their actions or attempting to negotiate, they escalated immediately. Amber and Linda launched a highly coordinated public smear campaign across every available social media platform. Amber posted a tearful, expertly lit video in her custom bridal robe, her mascara running perfectly down her cheeks. She publicly accused me of being a bitter, jealous sister who had deliberately ruined her dream wedding purely out of financial spite. Linda swiftly followed up with a long, agonizing post detailing the heartbreak of having a toxic, unstable daughter who had abandoned the family on the most important day of their lives. My phone flooded with angry messages from extended family members, mutual acquaintances, and people I hadn't spoken to in years. They demanded I apologize, aggressively calling me selfish, vindictive, and cruel for pulling my financial support without warning. To the untrained eye, Amber was the tragic, abandoned victim, and I was the cold-hearted villain trying to destroy her happiness. But I did not panic. I didn't rush to the comment section to passionately defend myself or plead for public understanding. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I treated their highly public meltdown strictly as evidence collection. Every dramatic post, every hostile text message, every fabricated timeline was meticulously screenshotted, archived, and forwarded directly to my legal counsel. While they were busy weaponizing their social networks, assuming public pressure would force me into total compliance, I was already sitting in a high-rise conference room with my legal team. They were operating on raw emotion and optics. I was operating on a strictly legal framework. Let them have the likes, the shares, and the sympathetic comments. I was securing the subpoenas. I instructed my lawyer to aggressively dig into the exact terms of my father's estate trust. If they were willing to drug me to secure it, there had to be a concrete paper trail proving their intent. The public smear campaign was nothing but background noise. The real battle was happening in the ledgers, and I was going to strip them down to the very last cent. I watched the notifications roll in, completely detached. They thought shame was a valid currency. I was about to show them the crushing weight of federal law. The true scope of their criminal operation surfaced exactly 48 hours later. I sat across from my lead attorney, David, as he slid a certified copy of my late father's trust documents across the polished glass table. He had pulled the files directly from the county records using expedited legal channels. "Look closely at the authorization page," David instructed, tapping a manicured finger on the final sheet of the heavy document. There, glaring at me in black ink, was my own signature. It explicitly authorized the complete and irrevocable transfer of my $6 million share of the estate directly into a newly established trust controlled exclusively by Linda and Amber. To bypass legal safeguards, they had bribed a corrupt notary to authenticate the forged document, making it appear legally binding on paper. The document was dated 3 days prior. The problem was, I had never seen this document in my life, let alone signed it. This wasn't just a petty dispute over wedding catering or a standard family feud fueled by jealousy. The criminal twist had been executed with chilling precision. Amber and Linda had forged my signature on a $12 million estate trust document. The disturbing plot Mark had overheard suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. The heavy sedatives they intended to slip into my rehearsal dinner weren't just meant to temporarily incapacitate me. They were designed to hospitalize me. A severe medical emergency would keep me entirely out of communication, while the forged documents cleared the final legal hurdles and the assets were permanently transferred. They had reduced my entire life to an administrative obstacle that needed to be aggressively cleared. I realized in that exact moment that my sister wasn't just its own role, she was a felon. My mother wasn't just a negligent parent who played favorites, she was an active conspirator in massive corporate fraud. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was structural. They had systematically used the chaos of the wedding week, the stress of the event, and my role as a subservient bridesmaid as the ultimate smokescreen to execute grand larceny. I didn't feel the sting of a daughter's heartbreak. De-romanticizing our relationships was the most liberating business decision I had ever made. I looked at the forged signature, studying the slight imperfections in the ink. This wasn't a family relationship waiting to be salvaged. It was a criminal enterprise demanding to be dismantled. They committed wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny, I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Draft the injunction immediately, contact the district attorney's office. Provide them with everything. David nodded, already drafting the lethal legal strikes. The trap they had built for me was incredibly detailed, but they had left their own digital and physical fingerprints all over the mechanics. The documents for fraud were successfully compiled. The legal machinery was officially in motion, and I was going to let it crush them. The climax arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, shattering the quiet productivity of my architectural firm. Linda, Amber, and the groom, Kevin, exploited a momentary lapse in the front desk security during a delivery shift and barged aggressively into the executive corridor, demanding immediate access to my office. They fully expected to find the timid, compliant dropout they could easily bully back into submission and extort for funds. Instead, they found me standing calmly behind a massive drafting table, flanked perfectly by Mark and my lead attorney. "You are going to fix the absolute mess you made, Elena," Linda demanded, her voice echoing shrilly in the glass-walled office. Amber stood closely beside her, arms crossed defensively, still trying to project an air of golden child authority. Kevin stood slightly behind them, looking incredibly annoyed and impatient. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply slid a thick black binder across the drafting table. It contained the meticulous bank records, the frozen accounts, and on the very top, the forensic analysis of my forged signature on the $12 million trust document, alongside a stamped, certified copy of the formal criminal indictment. Amber snatched the paper with a sneer. As her eyes scanned the formal fraud charges, the color drained entirely from her face, leaving her chalk white. Linda leaned in to read over her shoulder, and her aggressive posture collapsed the exact moment she saw the official police seal. Their rapid disintegration perfectly illustrated the power illusion of the empty wallet. They had always operated under the psychological delusion that their superiority was inherent, failing entirely to realize the vast difference between having material wealth and actually being a person of true value. Their entire position in society was a fragile facade rented with stolen and coerced money. The exact moment that capital was stripped away, they had absolutely no internal character to keep them standing. They were hollow structures instantly collapsing under the weight of an audit. Kevin looked over Amber's shoulder, reading the word felony. He stepped away from his bride as if she were highly radioactive. He wasn't marrying into a wealthy estate. He was marrying into a catastrophic criminal indictment. "You forged a federal document," I said, my voice cutting through their stunned silence like a diamond blade. "The district attorney has already issued the warrants. The estate is permanently frozen, and the money you relied on to fund your illusions is gone." They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I'd stopped playing along. The horrifying realization that they had lost absolutely everything, the estate, the wedding, their social standing, shattered their reality. There were no more threats. There was only the clinical reality of a completely ruined balance sheet. I pointed to the glass door. "My security team will escort you out." The execution of judgment was swift and absolute. Kevin immediately called off the engagement, rapidly fleeing the massive public relations nightmare and severing all personal and financial ties with the family. The $12 million estate was placed under court-ordered preservation, effectively stripping Linda and Amber of any potential access, while my legal team moved to solidify my sole control. Linda and Amber faced mounting, insurmountable legal fees they could no longer afford. They had bet their entire future on a hostile corporate takeover and lost their entire portfolio. The criminal justice system was now managing the liquidation of their freedom, leaving them to navigate a reality where they had absolutely zero leverage. I didn't throw a party to celebrate their ruin. I simply closed their accounts, archived the legal files, and moved forward with my own upward trajectory. I officially took the lead architect position on a massive downtown urban development project I had been aggressively pursuing for years. Stepping onto that active construction site with Mark by my side, surrounded by heavy steel, poured concrete, and the deafening noise of progress, I finally felt the suffocating label of the invisible black sheep burn away completely. I was no longer an unrecognized asset, subsidizing someone else's vanity or absorbing their toxic behavior. I was the chief architect of my own life, building on a solid foundation of absolute truth and unwavering mutual respect. I've come to realize that establishing ironclad boundaries isn't an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. When people show you that they view your existence purely as a resource to be extracted, the only rational response is to immediately close their access and permanently revoke their privileges. Family is not a perpetual debt you owe to people who continuously harm you, nor is it a contract you must honor when the other party operates in bad faith. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. By letting go of the desperate need for their validation, I finally forgave myself for ever believing I was worth less than I am. True peace comes from building a beautiful, secure life where toxic people simply cannot afford the price of admission. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to choose yourself.